Chapter 7 deals with socio-emotional development in middle childhood. Socialization is a major goal of all people and involves teaching children the values, mores, norms, and roles of their culture. The task falls initially to primary caregivers, which is why it's so important to focus on the impact of those caregivers on socialization. The chapter examines the many socializing forces in a child's life, including the family system. The emphasis is on children of elementary school age and covers development from the years of approximately 7 to about age 12. In addition to the impact of the family system on a child's development, the chapter will also examine the role of parenting, divorce, remarriage, peers, and the electronic media as sources of socialization. Also important are the individual characteristics of children, as these often will determine the quality of parenting and the nature of those peer interactions. Also, the chapter will examine children's understanding of others in terms of their descriptions of others and the development of perspective taking as well as prejudice. The chapter is also related to the two preceding chapters. From chapter 5, you can draw connections between the development of empathy and positive peer relationships, attachment and parenting style, and the social roles of gender and violence in electronic media sources. From chapter 6, you can examine the impact of cognitive development on changes in the complexity of peer relationships and the social networks of older children, as well as the features of educational settings that enhance socialization. So, where to begin? Let's start with the idea of socialization in general. That particular notion is defined as teaching children values, roles, and behaviors of their particular culture. It's a major goal of all people and is influenced by family, peers, and the media. As children become socialized, they begin to understand more about other people. To begin, after socialization and its definition, it's important to consider the family relationship. The family is a social system. The family structure has evolved in such a way to protect and nurture young children during their development. Now, early theorists held that the view that parents directly and indirectly determine their children's development, but now theorists have come to view families from a contextual perspective and believe that families form a system of interacting elements. The family itself is embodied in other social systems that can affect family dynamics either directly or indirectly. Parenting can also be described in terms of general dimensions that represent stable aspects of parental behavior and that hold across different situations. The degree of warmth and responsiveness expressed by parents to their children will differ from parent to parent. Warm parents tend to be a little more involved with their children. They respond to their emotional needs and spend considerable time with them. They enjoy hearing their children's experiences and see when their children are upset, and also, of course, try to comfort those children. Uninvolved parents, on the other hand, seem a bit more focused on their own needs and aren't nearly as interested in their children's daily activities. Uninvolved parents tend to pay very little attention to their children's emotional states and don't try to comfort them even when they're upset. Now, the amount of social control that parents exert over their children will also differ. There's the idea of psychological control. Some parents will make efforts to manipulate their children's behavior states by, for example, withdrawing their love or making children feel guilty. There's behavioral control. Some parents are dictatorial and they will try to regulate every facet of their children's lives, while others exert little or no control over their children whatsoever. Effective control involves a minimum of psychological control combined with an intermediate amount of behavioral control. Now, when parents have reasonable expectations for their children and monitor their activities, their children tend to be much better adjusted. And when we combine warmth and control, it provides 4 prototypical dimensions of parenting. Now, those particular styles of parenting are referred to as authoritarian, authoritative, indulgent and permissive, as well as indifferent or uninvolved. Now, authoritarian parents are controlling, but uninvolved. Authoritative parents are fairly controlling, but are also very responsive to the needs of their children. Indulgent and permissive children, or indulgent and permissive parents, they love, but they exert very little control over their children, while indifferent and uninvolved parents are neither warm nor controlling. From the research, authoritative parenting seems to be the best fit for most children. For both cognitive and social development, it happens to be a bit easier. Children tend to thrive on a parental style that combines control, warmth, and elements of affection. Children with authoritative parents, on the other hand, tend to have higher grades and are responsible, self-reliant, as well as friendly. Authoritarian parents, on the other hand, those children tend to be very unhappy. They have low self-esteem and are frequently overly aggressive. Children with permissive parents are often very impulsive and have very little self-control, while children with uninvolved parents often do poorly in school and are somewhat more aggressive. There will also be variations associated with culture as well as socioeconomic status. Parenting styles vary depending on the culture. European Americans want their children to be happy and self-reliant individuals. They believe that goals are best achieved when parents are warm and exert moderate control. Now, in Asian and Latin American countries, individualism is far less important than cooperation and collaboration. In China, for example, cultural principles dictate emotional restraint and obedience. Parents are less likely to express affection than are American mothers, and their children learn to obey without question. In Latino culture, greater emphasis is placed on the strong family ties as well as respecting the roles of the family members in general. Again, parenting styles will vary within cultures based on the parent's socioeconomic status as well as income to start. Parents with lower socioeconomic status tend to be more controlling and more punitive. Due to their limited resources, parents with lower socioeconomic status often lead more stressful lives and are far more likely to live in neighborhoods where violence, drugs, and crime are more commonplace. They may be too stressed to invest the energy necessary for authoritative parenting, and parents with a higher socioeconomic status tend to be more authoritative. Genetics also influences parenting. Families and parenting are adaptations that evolved over a period of time to provide for children until they mature. Genes linked to the behaviors that make for effective parenting are more likely to be passed on to other generations. As parents, identical twins are more similar than fraternal twins. Behavioral genetic studies reveal environmental influences on parenting style, the quality of the parents' marital relationship, for example, as well as children's presentation in their own environment. Parental behavior also influences the child's behavior. Direct instruction, for example, involves telling a child what to do, when to do it, and even why. Direct instruction, when it's paired with parental coaching, helps children master social and emotional skills. Modeling, combined with younger children's observational learning, leads to imitation. Observational learning can also produce counter-imitation, which is learning what should not be done by observing other people's behavior. Feedback can be used by parents to indicate whether a behavior is appropriate or should continue, or whether the behavior is inappropriate and should stop. Reinforcement is any action that increases the likelihood of a response that it follows, while punishment is any action that discourages the recurrence of the response that it follows. Parents often unwittingly reinforce the very behaviors they want to discourage, and they have difficulty trying to discern which way it is they should respond. Punishment, when it's offered, needs to be effective. For it to be effective, it must be administered directly after the undesired behavior occurs. An undesired behavior consistently leads to the same punishment. Punishment is then accompanied with an explanation as to why the child was punished. A warm and affectionate relationship exists with the parent and the person administering the punishment. Now, punishment also has some serious drawbacks. It tends to be primarily suppressive, and it may not always work with some children. Punitive punishment can also have some undesirable side effects. Spanking, in general, is ineffective in getting a child to comply with parental requests. It actually may lead to children being more aggressive. Harsher forms of physical punishment are associated with a range of negative outcomes. Physical punishment is also banned in numerous countries around the globe. One method that combines the best features of punishment while avoiding its shortcomings is timeout. In timeout, a child who misbehaves must briefly sit alone in a quiet, unstimulating location. A timeout period usually lasts for a few minutes. During that timeout, both caregivers and child typically calm down. When timeout is over, a parent can talk with the child and explain why the punishment or why the behavior was punished and why that behavior is objectionable and what the child should do instead. Now, research also indicates that chronic parental conflict can be harmful for children. Parental conflict affects children's development through three distinct mechanisms. Children tend to feel anxious, frightened, and sad. Parental conflict spills over into the parent-child relationships, and constant parental conflict prevents parents from being able to invest in high-quality parenting skill. Now, there are also forces outside the family that can influence parenting and the child's development. For example, a parent's lack of job security can lead to a decrease in the child's self-esteem and an increase in concentration problems. Work-related stress is also another factor that can influence children's development. It leads to less effective parenting, less tolerance levels and acceptance, and an increase in conflict. Children can also contribute as well as deal with what we call reciprocal influence. Two characteristics of a child's influence and how it influences their parents will treat them. Age, for example. Parenting tends to change as children grow. Temperament and behavior, as the other example, can have powerful effects on parental behavior and vice versa. Children's behavior helps to determine how parents treat them, and the resulting parental influence then affects a child's behavior, which in turn causes parents to again change their behavior. Siblings are also a factor in the family system. The birth of a sibling can be a stressful time for an older child, particularly among younger children, and when parents tend to ignore their older child's needs. One of the benefits of a sibling's birth is that fathers become more involved with their older children, as mothers must devote more of their time to newborns. Siblings get along better when they are of the same sex. Sibling relationships generally improve as the younger child approaches adolescence because siblings begin to perceive one another more as equals. Parents contribute to the quality of the sibling relationship both directly from parenting itself and indirectly from the quality of the parents' relationship with each other. Unique features among different ethnic groups also are a factor in family relationships. In African American families, sibling relations were more positive when children had a stronger ethnic identity. In Mexican American families, siblings feel closer and spend more time with siblings, and when they do that, they have a stronger commitment to the family system, also referred to as a family obligation. Did you know that the best estimate is that between 2 and 4% of U.S. children are adopted? There are about 50,000 children being adopted annually, and about 10,000 children are adopted annually from other countries such as China or Ethiopia. Now, adoption of children with special needs has also become much more common. Compared to children living with biological parents, adopted children are quite similar in terms of temperament, attachment, self-esteem, and cognitive development. Adopted children are more prone to school adjustment issues and to conduct disorders. Problems are more common when children are adopted at an older age and when their care before adoption was poor. In recent years, adopted children are more likely to communicate with their birth families, and it's an arrangement known as open adoption. What about birth order? I was born as the older child, and I promise it certainly influenced our family system. Parents of firstborn children have very high expectations. They're more affectionate and more punitive toward their firstborns. Firstborns tend to have higher IQ scores and are more likely to go to college. Firstborns are more willing to conform to parents' and adults' requests. Only children were found to succeed more in school and have higher levels of intelligence, leadership, autonomy, and maturity. Comparisons in China between only children and children with siblings often find no differences. When differences are found, the advantage usually goes to the only child. Contrary to popular stereotypes, only children aren't spoiled brats necessarily. Only Instead, only children are, for the most part, much like children who grow up with siblings. Now, divorce and remarriage is also a factor that influences the socio-emotional development of children. According to all theories of childhood development, divorce is distressing for children because it involves conflict between parents and, usually, separation from one of them. Research also reveals that in-school achievement, conduct, adjustment, self-control, and the parent-child relationships for children from divorced families fared poorly compared with those of other children. Children of divorce are more likely to experience conflict in their own marriages, to have negative attitudes toward marriage, and to become divorced themselves. In addition, they report lower life satisfaction and are more likely to experience depression. The first year following a divorce is often the most rocky for both parents and children alike. 2 years after a divorce, most children begin to adjust to their new circumstances. Children adjust to divorce more readily if the parents are cooperative with each other. Joint custody happens when both parents retain legal custody of the children. Children benefit from joint custody if the parents manage to relate very well with one another. Traditionally, mothers have been awarded primary custody. When fathers remain involved in parenting and get along with their ex-wives, or more than one, children will usually benefit. Now, divorce influences childhood development in several ways. Children fared best when both parents are free of psychological problems themselves, get along with each other, stay involved with their children, and parent together effectively. Children are less likely to suffer harm from divorce when they are temperamentally easy, are smart, don't consistently interpret life events negatively, and actively cope with problems. Now, parents can reduce divorce-related stress in children and help them cope with their new life circumstances by using the following rules. Explain together to children why they are divorcing and what the children can expect to happen to them. Reassure children that they will always be loved and always be cared for by their parents. Back up their words with actions by remaining involved in the lives of their children. Expect that their children will sometimes be angry or sad about the divorce, but encourage them to discuss their feelings. Don't compete with each other for their children's love and attention. Don't take out your anger with each other on their children, or to be critical of the other spouse in front of children. And don't ask those children to mediate disputes. Parents should work out their own problems without putting children in the middle of those conflicts. Now, blended families are often the resulting unit when parents have divorced and remarry other individuals. Those particular family units have biological parents, step-parents, and children all together. It's known as the blended family. The most common form of a blended family is a mother, her children, and a stepfather. Children can thrive in blended family circumstances. Children close to their mother and stepfather report being very well adjusted. They show a preference to biological children brought into a blended family can lead to some conflict and occasional unhappiness. Now, for those who are stepdads, there are some good strategies to be involved with. Stay involved with the children. Avoid encroaching on other established relationships. And some strategies for stepmoms. Be careful not to over-focus on the new relationship. Maintain time and affection with all of the children. Second marriages are slightly more likely than first marriages to end in divorce, particularly when stepchildren are involved. So divorce can be a crazy thing. Speaking from experience, been there and done that. Bear in mind, as challenging as it may be to hear, children can and most often do adjust. Now, what do we do when the parent-child relationship goes crazy, or how it goes wheels off? The maltreatment of children comes in many forms. Physical abuse involves assault that leads to injury. Sexual abuse involves fondling, intercourse, and other sexual behavior. Neglect occurs when children do not receive adequate food, clothing, or medical care. And psychological abuse involves ridicule, rejection, or humiliation. It's estimated that approximately 700,000 children annually suffer maltreatment or neglect in some way. About 75% are neglected, 17% are abused physically, 8% are sexually abused, and 6% are maltreated psychologically. Some children deal with more than one type of abuse. Now, who are abusing parents? 3 important factors determine if a child is likely to be a target for abuse. From a cultural perspective, cultural attitude towards physical punishment plays a role. Poverty, because of a lack of money, it increases the stress of daily life, as well as the children living in poverty are more likely to receive maltreatment from their parents. Another cultural factor is social isolation. Abuse is more likely when families are socially isolated from other relatives or neighbors. Parental factors related to abuse. Parents who maltreat their children often were maltreated themselves. They use ineffective parenting techniques, have unrealistic expectations, and often believe that they are powerless to control their children. In families where abuse occurs, the couple's interactions are often unpredictable, unsupportive, and unsatisfying for both husbands and wives. There are also factors related to children themselves as it relates to maltreatment. Infants and preschoolers are more often abused than older children. Children who are frequently ill are also more often abused. Stepchildren are another group who finds themselves at risk for abuse. Now, children who are abused will often lag behind in social and emotional development. The cognitive development and academic performance, which means lower grades and test scores in such children, is often disturbed. Abused children exhibit school-related behavioral problems, and abuse leads to risk for psychiatric disorders in adults. Now, there are also several factors that protect children from the damaging effects of abuse. Ego resilience denotes children's ability to respond adaptively and resourcefully to new situations. It's one factor that protects children. Another is the positive mother-child relationship. It also becomes a preventative factor. Now, to eliminate child maltreatment requires different approaches. The American attitudes toward acceptable levels of punishment and poverty would have to change. Parents need counseling and training in parenting skills. Parents require social support. Early childhood intervention programs are useful tools that can help with prevention. Maltreatment is also typically a consequence of ignorance and burden, not malice. Now we come to the notion of peers. Friendship is a voluntary relationship between two people involving mutual liking. The key elements of friendships for younger children are that they like each other and enjoy playing together. For older children, trust and assistance are additional factors in friendship. With adolescence comes another layer of complexity to friendships because trust becomes more important in adolescent friendships. The emergence of intimacy in adolescent relationships means that friends come to be seen as sources of social and emotional support. Hand in hand with intimacy, of course, is loyalty. Have you ever considered this question? Who are friends? Friendship is more common between children similar in race, sex, and gender. Friendships are more common between children from the same race and ethnic group. Friendships among children of different groups form more positive attitudes toward minority group members and reduce relational aggression. Friends also tend to be alike in popularity. Popular youth tend to befriend popular peers. Friends have similar attitudes toward school, recreation, and problem behaviors. Friends also become more similar in their attitudes and values. Now, developing opposite sex friendships does happen with some children. Boys and girls are equally likely to have opposite sex friendships. Children with same and opposite sex friends tend to be very well adjusted. Children with only opposite sex friendships tend to be unpopular and less competent in social contexts. Now, there are several other factors for the differences in the quality and longevity of friendships. Some friendships tend to be brief because children lack the social skill to sustain them. Some friendships end because, when conflicts arise, children are more concerned about their own interests and are unwilling to compromise or negotiate. Friendships also end when children discover that their needs and interests aren't as similar as they thought initially. Children with good friends cope better with life stresses, are less likely to be victimized by peers, and are at a lower risk for disorders and aggressive behavior. Sometimes friends spend much of their time discussing each other's personal problems, which is known as co-rumination, which strengthens girls' friendships but also puts them at risk for greater depression and anxiety. Aggressive children tend to encourage each other's aggressive behavior. Teens engaging in risky behavior often reinforce others' risky behavior. When it comes to groups, older children and adolescents often form cliques or small groups of like-minded children or adolescents who are friends and tend to be similar in age, sex, race, and attitudes. Now, a crowd is a larger mixed-sex group of older children or adolescents who have similar values and attitudes and are known by a common label. Some crowds have higher status than others, and members of higher status crowds often have higher self-esteem than members of lower status crowds. When parents practice authoritative parenting, their children become involved with crowds that endorse adult standards of behavior. When their parenting style is neglectful or permissive, children are less likely to identify with adult standards of behavior and instead join crowds with negative behaviors, which often results in substance use. Common to most groups is what we call dominance hierarchy. A well-defined structure is headed by a leader to whom all other members of the group defer. Physical power and individual traits that relate to the group's main function determine hierarchy. Peer influence is often characterized as an irresistible, harmful force. Children can resist peer pressure and avoid behaving in ways that are clearly antisocial. Peer pressure can also be positive, urging peers to participate in school activities, and is most powerful when the standards for appropriate behavior are not clear-cut. Peer influence is stronger when youth are younger and more socially anxious. Crowd influence can influence members also because they want to identify with the group. The mere presence of peers can prime an adolescent's brain reward system, making it sensitive to rewards associated with risky behavior. What about popularity or rejection? Popular and rejected children can be placed in one of 5 categories. Popular children are liked by many classmates. They're skilled academically as well as socially. They are good students who are usually friendly, cooperative, and helpful. They're more skilled at communicating and better at integrating themselves into ongoing conversations or play sessions. Now, rejected children are disliked by many classmates. They tend to be socially awkward, and aggressive children are often rejected because they rely on an aggressive interpersonal style. Now, these children are not only overly aggressive, they are also hyperactive, socially unskilled, and unable to regulate their emotions. Other rejected children tend to be shy, withdrawn, timid, and lonely. There's also a group referred to as controversial children. They're both liked and disliked by classmates. Average children are liked and disliked by some classmates, but without the intensity found in popular, rejected, or controversial children. Neglected children are ignored by everybody. From a cultural perspective, in Israel, popular children are more likely to be assertive and direct. In China, shy children traditionally were often popular because they restrained their behavior. Now, in contemporary culture, there's a greater emphasis on taking initiative and being assertive, which of course then creates potential consequences related to rejection. Now, peer rejection can be traced to the influence of the parent, or in many cases, the primary caregiver. Friendly and cooperative parents demonstrate effective social skills, while belligerent and combative parents demonstrate tactics that are much less effective. Parents contribute to their children's social skill and popularity through their disciplinary practice. Harsh and inconsistent discipline is associated with antisocial, aggressive behavior in children and making them less popular. The origins of rejection can be traced to parenting. Socially awkward, aggressive children are rejected because they rely on a more aggressive interpersonal style. Now, aggressive children also have their victims. Research has identified three forms of particularly aggressive behavior. The first is instrumental aggression. It's when a child uses aggression to achieve a goal. Hostile aggression is unprovoked and its primary goal is to intimidate, harass, and to humiliate. Relational aggression is when children try to hurt others by undermining their social relationships. Now, children's tendencies to behave aggressively tend to be a little more stable over time. Some of the longer-term outcomes of children aggressing include poor adjustment in high school, unemployment, and violent behavior in adulthood. Chronic victims of aggression are often very lonely, anxious, and depressed. They tend to dislike school and have lower self-esteem. A small percentage of children tend to be chronic targets of bullying. Some youth have been victims of electronic bullying, being harassed via texting or social media. Two types of individuals are more likely to become victims themselves. Victims of aggression become victims because they're aggressive themselves. They are often overreactive and tend to be restless, easily irritated, and easily baited. Withdrawn and submissive victims tend to be withdrawn and submissive, and either are unwilling or unable to defend themselves from their overly aggressive peers. Other factors that contribute to children becoming victims include obesity, depression, disability, or immigrant status. Now, victims can be taught different ways of dealing with aggression. Schools can build a school climate in which bullying is not acceptable. Learning social skills for dealing with peers, learning strategies for regulating their emotions, as well as parental support. Now, lastly, we have the electronic media. Television, for example, has led us to understand that the more we watch, the more we move toward aggressive behavior, while watching pro-social television tends to offer more socially skilled behavior. Critics argue that TV tends to lead to poor concentration, shorter attention spans, reduced creativity, passivity, and lazy thinking. Yet research does not consistently support these criticisms. The biggest impact of television is the content of the program. Video games. Adolescent boys spend nearly an hour every day playing video games. Girls average about 10 minutes a day. Games that emphasize perceptual as well as spatial skills improve spatial ability, processing speed, and executive function. Games that are violent can make children more aggressive, less empathetic, and desensitized to violence. Roughly 10% of youth get hooked on video games and show symptoms associated with pathological gambling and less success in school. Social media has its own challenges. Adolescents spend nearly 90 minutes daily using social media or video chatting. Social media use and texting leads most to feel more connected with friends. Self-disclosure via texting and social media use promotes high-quality friendships. Using social media helps adolescents make new friends and build relationship skills. Cyberbullying refers to the use of social media to harm other people. Now, of all adolescents, 10 to 40% report being victims of cyberbullying. Perpetrators and victims of cyberbullying tend to be of the same as those to offline bullying. How do we understand other people in general? Now, as children develop, more sophisticated cognitive processes cause self-descriptions to become richer, more abstract, and include more psychological properties. Children describe other people in terms of concrete features, such as behavior, and progress to describing them in terms of abstract traits. Until about 10 years of age, children tend to look for positive, not negative traits in other people. As children move beyond the preschool years, they realize that others see the world differently, both literally and figuratively, and they start to take the perspective of other people. According to Selman, children go through 5 stages of perspective taking. Undifferentiated, children know that others have different thoughts and feelings, but confuse them with their own thoughts and feelings. Social information is when children know that perspectives differ because people have different access to different information. Self-reflective children can step into another person's shoes. Third-person children can understand a third person's perspective. And from a societal perspective, children will realize that the third-person perspective is influenced by context. There are some links that improve perspective taking to the developing theory of mind. The process of recursive thinking allows children to understand what another person thinks based on the information that person has. In other words, he thinks that she thinks. Then we have to deal with the idea of prejudice. Once preschool children identify with a group, they begin to show prejudice, which is a negative view of others based on their membership in a specific group. By age 10 or 11, most children are aware of broadly held racial stereotypes. Prejudice declines during the elementary school years and increases again during early adolescence. Greater prejudice in older children and adolescents reflects both a more positive view of their own group and a more negative view of others. Parents, teachers, and other adults can help children of prejudice. They can encourage friendly and constructive contacts between children from different groups. They can encourage intergroup contact. Prejudice is reduced when the participating groups of children are equal in status, when the contact between the groups involves pursuing common goals, and when parents and teachers support the goal of reducing prejudice. Ask children to function in different roles. When children learn about racism and that minority groups often experience, they tend to have more positive attitudes toward those groups and those particular people who have experienced racism. Socioeconomic or socio-emotional development in childhood is a complicated subject. Lots of twists and lots of turns. If I can help you with any other information related to Chapter 7, please don't hesitate to contact me. We'll see you soon.